The whole town called it a waste. They said Harlan Voss had finally lost his mind. That was 3 years before the flood. Harlan was 64 years old the summer he started digging. His neighbors on Cutter's Bend Road watched from their driveways, arms folded, while he rented a backhoe and tore up the gentle slope behind his property for 6 straight days. They saw the earthworks going up, long, curved berms of compacted soil, 3 feet high and 4 feet thick, following the natural contour of the land like a slow brown wave frozen in place. They saw him haul in riprap by the truckload, fitting stones along the base, the way another man might lay bricks for a garden wall. Except this wall was longer than a football field, and it curved at both ends like cupped hands. "Harlan," said his neighbor, Clifton Sears, leaning on the fence one afternoon. Harlan straightened up and pushed his hat back. He had a face like weathered oak, not unkind, but hard in a way that didn't ask for your opinion. 22 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 year in the Mekong Basin studying river hydrology after the '91 floods. He knew what water did when it had nowhere to go. He'd spent the better part of his adult life watching it find somewhere to go anyway. "Floodwall," he said. Clifton looked at the flat blue sky, then down at the dry creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, no deeper than a man's shin in August, same as it had been every August that either of them could remember. Then he looked back at Harlan. "Son," he said, though Clifton was barely 5 years older, "this is Pryor County. That creek hasn't jumped its banks since 1978, 1978, and 1953. Harlan said, and 1931 before that. Clifton nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've decided the conversation is over. "Well," he said, "it's your money." It was, in fact, a significant amount of his money. Harlan's daughter, Renata, no, wait, his daughter's name was Lee. Lee had driven up from Knoxville the second weekend of June, stood at the edge of the excavation in her good shoes, and asked him in a careful voice whether everything was all right, whether he was sleeping, whether maybe this project, ambitious as it was, could wait until he talked to someone first. He understood what she meant by someone. "I'm fine, Leigh. Dad, you've spent close to $40,000. Closer to 50 by the time the riprap's done." She was quiet for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes, dark and attentive, the kind that didn't miss much. Her mother had been gone 11 years now, and Harlan still felt the shape of that absence every morning when the coffee finished brewing, and there was nobody to hand the first cup to. "Mom would have thought this was crazy," Lee said finally. "Your mother thought a lot of things were crazy," he said. "She also made me buy flood insurance on this house for 31 years, and I never once complained about it." He watched Lee look at the creek. It was running low and clear, threading through its channel between the willows, harmless as a garden hose. "There's a dog at the shelter in Millhaven," Harlan said. "Big one. Part Chesapeake, part something else they can't identify. He was found tied to a fence post out on Route 9 in February. Been there 6 months." Lee turned to look at him. "I'm picking him up Tuesday," Harlan said. His name at the shelter was Captain, which Harlan thought was a little on the nose, so he renamed him Tide. Lee had not been consulted on this decision. When she found out, she called and said the name was morbid given the circumstances of the earthworks project, and Harlan said he'd chosen it because the dog was the color of an incoming tide in shallow water, that dark tawny gold shot through with gray, and not for any other reason. This was partly true. Tide was 78 pounds of quiet, steady attentiveness. He moved through the house as though he'd always lived there, found his spot in the corner of the living room, where the afternoon light fell in a long rectangle across the floor and settled. He didn't beg. He didn't bark at passing cars. When Harlan worked outside, Tide followed at a distance and lay in the shade and watched. When Harlan came back in, Tide followed and lay in a different spot and continued watching. It was the kind of presence Harlan hadn't realized he'd been missing until it was suddenly there. The berm work took 3 months. Then came the drainage channels, sloped and graveled, designed to route overflow away from the house and toward the low meadow on the far end of the property, which Harlan seeded with deep-rooted grasses specifically chosen to absorb standing water. He installed a sump system under the crawl space. He reinforced the foundation with waterproof membrane. He bought a whole house generator and ran it off a propane tank buried on the east side of the lot. Enough fuel for 90 days. Clifton Sears told people at the hardware store that Harlan had gone full doomsday. Barry Tollefson, who ran the feed store and coached youth baseball, said he'd heard Harlan was planning to take in livestock next. The Pryor County Courier ran a short piece, not mean, exactly, just amused, about a local veteran's ambitious landscaping project that had turned Cutter's Bend Road into something resembling a military fortification. Harlan clipped the article and put it in a drawer. He didn't mention it to Lee. What he told her instead, when she came back in October to see the finished work, was this. He had watched the Army Corps build temporary flood barriers across 3 continents and fail half the time because they were built by people who'd never lived with the water. He'd seen engineers in Houston design drainage for a 100-year storm, and then a 100-year storm came, and it turned out they'd calculated for the wrong 100 years. He had watched the Tennessee River do things in 2010 that it wasn't supposed to be able to do. And he'd watched neighborhoods full of people who trusted official flood maps lose everything they owned. "I'm not crazy," he said. "I'm correcting for probability." Leigh walked the length of the berm in her same good shoes, Tide padding along beside her. She had warmed slightly to the dog, which was all Harlan had hoped for. "It's impressive," she said at last. "I don't know if it'll work, but it's impressive." "It'll work," Harlan said. He was alone when the rain started that March. Lee was back in Knoxville with her husband and the twins had had some kind of winter stomach thing going through their school, so she was staying put. Harlan had talked to her Sunday evening. She'd sounded tired. The rain on Monday was unremarkable. This part of Tennessee got rain in March, the way it got humidity in July. You accepted it as a condition of life and planned around it. Harlan made soup and read and went to bed early, with Tide curled at the foot of the bed, which was not something Harlan had intended to permit but had failed to prevent. Tuesday the rain intensified. He checked the weather radio in the kitchen, an old unit he'd bought in 2004 and never stopped using, and listened to the National Weather Service talk about a slow-moving low-pressure system stalling over the Cumberland Plateau. Significant rainfall totals, they said. Possible localized flooding in low-lying areas. Harlan looked out the kitchen window at the creek. It was up, maybe 2 feet higher than usual, moving fast and dark, not alarming. Not yet. He pulled on his rain gear and walked the berm. Tide came with him, unconcerned by the rain in the way of dogs who have decided that weather is not a useful thing to worry about. Harlan checked his drainage channels, found them clear and running well. He walked the far end toward the meadow and saw that the grass was holding, doing what deep-rooted grass does. Drinking everything offered to it without complaint, he came back inside and made coffee and called Lee. "How bad is it up there?" she asked. "Fine here," he said. "How are the kids?" They talked for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with water. Wednesday was when it changed. Harlan had seen a lot of rain in his life, but he had rarely seen rain like that Wednesday rain. It didn't fall so much as arrive all at once, as though some container in the sky had simply been inverted. He stood at the back door with his second cup of coffee and watched it come down and felt a specific thing in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a heightened alertness, a sharpening of attention that had served him well in places where inattention was fatal. Tide pressed against his leg. By mid-morning, the creek had jumped its banks for the first time. It spread across the low field on the Sears property, which lay below the level of Harlan's land, and moved toward the road in a wide brown sheet. Harlan could see Clifton's truck in the driveway, not moving. He could see water in the drainage ditch along Cutter's Bend Road rising toward the asphalt. His own yard was dry. His own yard stayed dry. He spent Wednesday working. He walked his perimeter every hour, checking for any compromise in the berm, finding none. He ran the generator through a test cycle. He checked his supplies, canned goods, water, medical kit, the battery-powered radio. At 2 in the afternoon, the power went out. He heard the grid drop, a particular silence that settled over the neighborhood like something physical, and flipped on the generator without breaking stride. His lights came back on. He stood at the front window and looked out at Cutter's Bend Road and watched it disappear. It didn't happen all at once. The water came from 2 directions. From the creek, now completely out of its channel and spreading across every low point it could find, and from the road itself, which had become a channel. He watched it move. He'd watched water move 100 times in his career, and he still found it unsettling. The way it had no hurry and no hesitation. The way it simply went where gravity told it to go, indifferent to whatever was in the way. Clifton Sears called at 4:15. His voice had a quality Harlan had not heard in it before. "Harlan," Clifton said. "I've got water in my first floor." "How high?" "Coming up on 6 inches. It's coming in under the doors. I can't." He stopped. "I thought I had sandbags. I had sandbags from the '09 ice storm, but I don't know where." "Get upstairs," Harlan said. "You and whatever you need. Get upstairs and stay there. My wife's sister is over. We've got the dog. All 3 of you, go upstairs. You'll be fine. How's your place?" Harlan looked at his dry living room. Tide was in his spot by the window. "Fine," Harlan said. "Go upstairs, Clifton." The Tollefson family showed up at 6:30. Barry and his wife Janet and their youngest, still in high school, came up Harlan's driveway in their truck, which was high enough to have made it through the water on the road, and knocked on the door in the rain. They had a bag. They had their other dog, a beagle named something Harlan immediately forgot. They stood on his porch with the specific look of people who have arrived somewhere they were not sure they'd be welcome. "Your place is high and dry," Barry said. He was not a man who apologized easily, and he wasn't apologizing now. But something in his voice was different from the man who'd spoken at the hardware store. Different from the man who'd told people Harlan had gone full doomsday. "Roads are out on 3 sides. I didn't know where else." Harlan opened the door wider. "There's soup on the stove," he said. "Dog can go in the kitchen." 2 hours later, Vera McNulty from 4 houses down arrived with her elderly mother and a casserole dish. And the casserole dish was empty because she dropped it in the water getting to her car, but she was still carrying it, maybe because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. After Vera came a young couple, the Ashtons, who'd moved to Cutter's Bend Road 18 months ago from Nashville, and who didn't really know anyone yet, and who stood at the door with a baby in a carrier, and expressions of pure, shell-shocked bewilderment. Harlan settled people into rooms. He ran extension cords. He showed Barry where the generator was and how to restart it if it cycled off. He heated more soup, and then he ran out of soup and heated canned chili. And then Janet Tollefson took over the kitchen in the quiet way of someone who needed to be useful, and Harlan let her. Tide moved through all of it with perfect equanimity. He let Vera's mother scratch his ears. He investigated the Ashton's baby with professional thoroughness, and then lay down near the baby's carrier on the floor, in a position that looked less like sleeping and more like guarding, though perhaps that was Harlan projecting. It was the beagle that caused the problem. Sometime around 8:30, in the evening, in the noise and warmth of a house that now held 11 people and 2 dogs, the beagle slipped out the back door. Someone had propped it open for air, not realizing. The dog was there, and then the dog wasn't, and Barry's son, 17 and pale as chalk, came to find Harlan and said the dog's name was Biscuit, and Biscuit was gone. Harlan put on his rain gear. "You are not going out there," Janet Tollefson said from the kitchen doorway. "It's my back property," he said. "Berm's holding. The yard's safe. The yard may be safe, but you're 64 years old in the water." "Janet," he said, not unkindly, "I know this land." Tide was already at the door. They went out together. Harlan had a powerful flashlight, the kind he'd carried in the field, and he swept it across his yard. The berm was solid. dark in the rain, and beyond it he could hear the roar of what the creek had become. No longer a creek, but something that had borrowed the creek's location, and had no intention of returning it. His yard was wet but not flooded. His drainage channels were running hard and clear. He found Biscuit at the far end of the property, near the corner where the berm met the property fence. The beagle had gotten himself into a situation with a section of fence that had partially collapsed under the water pressure from the other side, and he was stuck. Not in deep water, but in the mud and debris that had piled up against the fallen section, panicked and scrabbling, and making a sound that was entirely undignified for a creature with as much confidence as a beagle usually projected. Tide reached him first. Harlan hadn't given the dog any command. He'd been sweeping the flashlight along the fence line when Tide simply went, purposeful and quiet, straight to the corner. And when Harlan got there 30 seconds later, Tide was standing at the edge of the debris, not in it, and Biscuit had stopped scrabbling. He was looking at Tide. His ears were flat and he was shaking, but he'd stopped moving, which was good, because movement in debris like that rarely helped. Harlan got Biscuit out. It took 5 minutes and cost him 1 boot, which sank into the mud and stayed there when he pulled his foot free. He carried the beagle back to the house in his sock, Tide walking at his side, and when he came through the back door into the light and warmth, Janet Tollefson made a sound he didn't fully know how to describe, relief and something larger than relief. And her son took the beagle and held him like a small child holds a stuffed animal. And nobody said anything for a moment. Then Vera's mother, who was 81 years old and had been sitting in Harlan's armchair with a blanket over her knees since 7 o'clock, said, "You have a very good dog." "I know," Harlan said. He found a dry pair of socks and went to make more coffee. The rain stopped at 11 that night. It didn't taper. It simply stopped, the way that particular kind of rain does, as though someone had closed a valve. The silence afterward was enormous. People sat with it for a while, and then slowly the sounds of an ordinary house at night reasserted themselves. The refrigerator, the generator's hum, someone's child asking for water. Harlan sat on the back step in the cold air with Tide beside him and looked at his yard. The berm stood. He'd built it with an 18-inch freeboard above his estimated 100-year flood level, and the water had come to within 8 inches of the top at its peak, and no further. He'd calculated for this. He'd spent 3 years thinking about this specific night, and the night had arrived, and the calculations had been right. He didn't feel vindicated. That wasn't the right word for it. He felt something quieter, the particular satisfaction of a man who had paid attention to what other people found it easier to ignore. Tide put his head on Harlan's knee. They sat there for a while, the man and the dog, listening to the water recede. By morning the road was passable, barely. Barry Tollefson left first, around 7, shaking Harlan's hand at the door in a way that involved both of Barry's hands and lasted longer than a regular handshake. His son went to the truck and came back and gave Tide a biscuit from his jacket pocket, which Tide accepted with the gravity it deserved. The Ashtons left with their baby and thanked Harlan 3 times in a row. The husband, then the wife, then the husband again. Vera McNulty took her mother and her empty casserole dish and turned back twice on the driveway. Clifton Sears walked over from next door around 8. His house had taken 10 inches of water on the ground floor, and he had the look of a man who had spent a night calculating losses. He stood on the dry gravel of Harlan's driveway and looked at the berm for a long time. "I owe you an apology," he said. "No," Harlan said. "You don't." Clifton looked at him. "You told me what you thought," Harlan said. "I knew what I knew. We were both just doing what people do." They stood there a moment. Tide sat between them, looking from one man to the other with the patient interest of a dog who has lived through a significant event and is now ready for breakfast. "That wall," Clifton said. "Could something like that work on my property, do you think?" Harlan looked at the Sears property, at the lay of the land, at the way the water had moved through it overnight and left its mark. "Yes," he said. "Come over this afternoon. I'll walk it with you." Lay called at 9. I've been watching the news, she said, and her voice had a different quality than he was used to, tighter, higher. Cutter's Bend Road is in the footage. I can see it looks like the whole neighborhood flooded. Most of it, Harlan said. A pause. How's the house? Dry. Another pause. Longer. Dad, she said. The berm held, he said. Drainage channels performed exactly as designed. Generator ran clean for 14 hours. We had 11 people here overnight. Biscuit is fine. Who's Biscuit? Barry Tollefson's beagle. Tide found him. She was quiet for so long that he checked to see if the call had dropped. Mom would have believed you, she said finally. From the beginning. I want you to know I know that. He leaned against the kitchen counter. Through the window he could see the berm, gray-brown in the morning light, exactly as he'd built it. Beyond it, out of sight, the creek was working its way back to its banks. She also would have named the dog something sensible, he said. Lee laughed. It was her mother's laugh, surprising, and then warm. What would she have named him? Harlan looked at Tide, who was sitting in his rectangle of morning light, watching Harlan with the steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything. I don't know, he said, but she'd have been right about it. He hung up and poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the counter and stood there for a moment, feeling the house around him, solid and dry and full of the previous night's people still present a dozen small ways. A child's drawing left on the coffee table, a borrowed blanket folded on the couch, the smell of Janet Tollefson's coffee still in the air. He picked up the cup. Outside, the sun was coming through, and the fields beyond the berm were glittering, where the water was pulling back into the earth, slow and patient, returning to where it belonged.